In my two earlier videos regarding redeemed bodies versus glorified bodies, I covered basically part one of my book, and then some additional material about glorified bodies. And then later I added a third appendix dealing with resurrected bodies. This video will briefly survey some of the previous material and then address the new material that was added to the book. Gary Whipple had written his book, Shock and Surprise Beyond the Rapture, in 1992. His thesis was, unfaithful believers do not receive glorified bodies for 1,000 years. In my book, The Outer Darkness, released in 2012, I objected since rewards are eternal. If unfaithful believers do not receive glorified bodies for 1,000 years, then they would not receive glorified bodies in the eternal state. So I postulated that there will be various degrees of glory. Unfaithful believers would receive a glorified body, but it would not glow like that of a faithful believer. Martha Lever released her delightful book, Morphe the Caterpillar, in 2013, and she was demonstrating that in her illustration, unfaithful believers do not receive glorified bodies. She did not specify if it was for just 1,000 years or for eternity. James Hollingsworth, who I'll refer to as Jim, in his book Christ Magnified in 2016, took the position that unfaithful believers never receive glorified bodies. This position is consistent with the eternal rewards position and therefore is an improvement over Whipple's position. Therefore, when I released my book, Misthological Models Part 3, in 2018, I allowed the possibility of Jim's proposal. I was not yet persuaded by his position. Nevertheless, I found it attractive. There were several texts that caused me to still retain my original position as my primary preference. Scott Crawford, who has written the book Perseverance Pays, in 2020 was teaching a series of lessons in which he teaches that glory is a reward. An extenuation of that argument would say, then, if glory is a reward, having a glorified body is a reward. So the extrapolation of his position would be in harmony with James Hollingsworth's position that unfaithful believers would never receive glorified bodies. So I wanted to investigate this possibility further, so I did so in my book, Redeemed Bodies versus Glorified Bodies. I have just released that here in 2021, and my thesis is glorified bodies are a reward. I am now in substantial agreement with Hollingsworth's projection. As I was finishing my book, I ran across a book by Mike Connell entitled Eternal Rewards. I appreciate Connell's insistence that rewards are eternal. This book was released in 2012, but I did not read it until I was completing my book. His thesis is unfaithful believers never receive glorified bodies. That position is consistent with Hollingsworth's thesis. So they're very similar in that regard. Nevertheless, I have added ... to Mike Connell's position because he has some differences that are reminiscent of Gary Whipple's position. Because Mike Connell is saying that there's 1,000 years wait before unfaithful believers are resurrected. So that's somewhat similar to Gary Whipple's position. The primary text that was causing me to be hesitant in accepting this proposition that unfaithful believers never receive the glorified body is 1 Corinthians 15. In my earlier videos, I've looked at this. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15:41, there's one glory of the sun, another glory of the moon, another glory of the stars, for a star differs from star in glory. And it talks about if it's sown in dishonor is raised in glory. So I thought that that would mean that all believers would have a glorified body, although they would vary in glory. I have now modified my position in that regard in my latest book, Redeemed Bodies versus Glorified Bodies. And I've come to conclude that Paul is not asserting the glorification of those believers who fail to shine like stars. Instead, he's insisting that those who shine like stars will be resurrected in glory. Connell's primary points of interest. Number one, he's arguing that only faithful believers are resurrected at the beginning of the 1,000 years. I disagree with him on that regard. Therefore, I've noted this position with a red font. Some of the text that he would use in this regard is Luke 20:35. Some believers are worthy of the resurrection, some believers are not. He took that to mean that only faithful believers have experienced the resurrection. I do not, as explained in my books. I believe that that means that some of the believers who are raptured and resurrected will be worthy of the experience. That does not necessarily mean that unfaithful believers will not be resurrected or raptured. Philippians 3:11, a well-known text, Paul says he is striving to earn the out-resurrection. Connell does appropriately deal with it as being a reward text, dealing with the out-resurrection. He would take that as being participation in the resurrection at the beginning of 1,000 years, as being a reward. I do not. I believe that this means a special status in the resurrection. Hebrews 11:35. Some women and other Old Testament worthies struggle and persevere in order that they might obtain a better resurrection. I do not take that as meaning that they are the only ones resurrected at that time, in contradistinction to Connell. Revelation 26 says, "Blessed are those who have a part in the first resurrection, and they will rule." Connell takes that to mean that they'll have a participation in the first resurrection, meaning they are the only ones resurrected. Rulership is a reward, therefore that is talking about a reward. He is correct. Nevertheless, I do not believe this means basic participation in the resurrection, but it is talking about a special status, a special portion in that resurrection. Therefore, I do not take these texts as limiting the resurrection, or for that matter, the rapture, to those who are faithful at the beginning of the millennial kingdom. In this point, Connell and I disagree. Second point, and this I have in black font because this shows I concur with him. He argues that unfaithful believers are cast into the outer darkness. For example, in Matthew 25:14-30, you know the text. Jesus is going on a long trip. He calls 3 servants, puts them in charge, and then when he comes back, he calls them to account. 2 of them hear, "Well done." The one who has hidden his talent has his talent taken away and is cast into the outer darkness. Connell argues that this is being cast away from the banquet rather into fire. I agree with him on that. Being cast in the outer darkness does not mean being cast into hell or Gehenna. Therefore, I would be in disagreement with Millennial Exclusionists or Gehenna misthologists who say that believers burn for 1,000 years. I do not believe that. Neither does Connell. We concur on that matter. Connell believes that unfaithful believers will serve as lowly earthly priests, saying that during 1,000 years they will serve in this capacity rather than as glorious priests in the heavenly city. So again, his thought is that if you're unfaithful, you'll be on earth. You'll be serving as earthly priests, but in a lowly position. You'll be excluded from the heavenly city, therefore you'll not serve as a heavenly priest. A fourth position he takes is that unfaithful believers are not raised until the end of the 1,000 years. I've already mentioned that. Also, unfaithful believers are not raptured, since the first resurrection is only for the faithful, so he's consistent in that regard. If you're not faithful, then you're not raptured, not raised. I disagree with him on both of those. But I agree with him on this next point. Unfaithful believers are excluded from entrance into the millennial kingdom. In Matthew 7:21-22, you know that text in which Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." What does it mean to do the will of my Father who is in heaven? If you were to look over at John, you might say, well, it just means to believe in Jesus for eternal life so that you can go to heaven when you die. And that would be a soteriological interpretation. I believe that is a valid interpretation. But I believe that this text can have a dualistic view, meaning it also can be interpreted to be dealing with rewards. And so the entrance into the kingdom of heaven might be talking about a reward. Connell has some problems dealing with that, how to explain that as a reward. I did also in 2012 in my book, Outer Darkness, but I had a way of doing so. Basileia could be translated as kingship. So they would be excluded from the kingship. And that would be one way to deal with that. So Jesus would be understood as saying, not everyone who says to me, Lord will enter the kingship of heaven, but who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Jesus would be understood in this capacity as saying, I never knew you intimately. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. So if this is a rewards passage, then it'd be talking about departing and going into outer darkness. That is how Connell takes it, and I would allow that as being a valid interpretation of the text. So unfaithful believers forfeit their priesthood for eternity. He argues that. I agree. Unfaithful believers do not get a glorified body. As a result of my present book, the research I've done therein, I would now take that position. Unfaithful believers never get a glorified body, not during 1,000 years, not during the eternal state. Unfaithful believers will not enter the heavenly city. Connell and I also agree on this. And he also argues that unfaithful believers are not part of the bride of Christ. I agree. Unfaithful believers are excluded from the bridal city, and they are not a part of the bride of Christ. Connell's primary logistical problems would include, number one, if the unfaithful are not resurrected, how can they serve as earthly priests? So how does he have these unfaithful believers not resurrected walking around on earth during 1,000 years and serving as lowly earthly priests? That is a little difficult to picture. You would think that they would need a resurrected body in order to be walking around on planet Earth. Point number two, how can the unfaithful serve as earthly priests during the millennium since they forfeit their priesthood in eternity? In other words, Connell's being somewhat inconsistent here, as picturing them as serving as lowly earthly priests for 1,000 years and then not serving as priests in eternity. Rewards are eternal, therefore priesthood or lack thereof would be an eternal result. It would not vary. His primary exegetical problems include, number one, if the unfaithful are not raptured, how can they appear at the Bema? 2 Corinthians 5:10 says, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. This happens at the rapture, and therefore, since Paul is saying we must all, he's talking about all believers, all church-age believers. Therefore, they must be raptured to be dealt with at this time. And also the text we mentioned earlier, Matthew 25:14 through 30. Jesus comes back from his trip. He calls his servants to account, faithful and unfaithful. This be a picture of the Bema, and therefore they must be called to account at the Bema, which would be before the 1,000 years, not after the 1,000 years. And then also there are various passages that indicate a rapture or resurrection of all believers before the millennial kingdom. Daniel 12:2, which is a primary focus of my book. 1 Thessalonians 4:16 through 17. And Paul is there talking about the rapture, and the rapture appears to be for all believers. 1 Corinthians 15:22 through 23 is indicating that this text applies to all those who are in Christ, in verses 51 and 52 also. So as it applies to the rapture, it appears that all those who are in Christ will have a resurrected body. And then the big boy, 1 Thessalonians 5:9 through 10, assures a full rapture. I have a book dedicated to the study of the rapture in this text, and that would be destined for salvation. And basically, when you look at 1 Thessalonians 1:10, what Paul is assuring us is that believers will be spared from the wrath of the day of the Lord, which will start at the rapture. God is not destined us for this whether we're morally awake or asleep or not. But earning the salvation is contingent. So God has not destined us for tribulational wrath, but for misthological salvation, for millennial salvation, millennial rulership. But the latter is contingent upon our faithfulness. This is an abbreviated model that I've developed, starting with Misthological Models Part 4, and now in my book, Misthological Models Part 5. I'm expanding upon it, but I have it here in this book as well, Redeemed Bodies. I'm using it to help with the logistics for Connell's position in this illustration. We know that there are 3 heavens, but how many kingdoms? Well, I would say that there's a universal kingdom. So this is God's kingdom that incorporates the entire multiverse. I've put the universal on what I would call the celestial aspect, but it also includes everything within it. And so if looking at universal kingdom, we can look at a text like John 3:3. You must be born again to enter this kingdom. And when you are born again, when you become a believer, God transfers you into this kingdom, Colossians 1:13. You are now a native member of this kingdom, eternally so. You cannot be removed from this universal kingdom. You're a child of God and therefore a member of this universal kingdom. Then there's the terrestrial kingdom. In Genesis 1:26, God put Adam in charge of this planet. In Revelation 5:10, it talks about God making us to be a kingdom of priests and us reigning upon the earth. So that's a terrestrial rulership, a terrestrial kingdom. And then we have an ancestral kingdom. That would be the promised land, the ancestral land promised to the Jews. They will inherit the promised land, I believe, at the beginning of the millennial kingdom. We'll have the planet rotate and it will be at the top. And there's a passage from 1 Samuel 24:20, talks about the kingdom of Israel, the ancestral kingdom. And then we have the misthopological kingdom. In Hebrews 12:22, it says, "But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels." So there's heavenly Jerusalem, and then we go down to verse 28. "Therefore, since we receive a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us show gratitude." What kingdom is it talking about? It's talking about the kingdom of the heavenly city, the heavenly Jerusalem. City-state, a kingdom in that regard as well. So abbreviating things, so looking at it somewhat simplistically, and looking at the kingdom spatially, we could say that we have a universal kingdom, a terrestrial kingdom, an ancestral kingdom, and a misthopological kingdom. Misthopological, again, means reward city. In my revised model, I believe there will be a celestial outer darkness for immortals. They will be in the outer realm, in the celestial outer darkness. And therefore, I would not need to postulate, like Connell did in his discussion, that unfaithful believers will be unresurrected and nevertheless being on earth. No. So I'm avoiding some logistical problems by posing that. I also believe there will be a terrestrial outer darkness for mortals. For example, believers who live to the end of the tribulation but are found unfaithful can be sent to the terrestrial outer darkness, whereas those who have been resurrected will be sent to the celestial outer darkness. Unfaithful believers who are resurrected will be sent to the celestial outer darkness. So as to the question of millennial exclusion, being excluded from millennial kingdom, is that possible spatially? Yes. It depends on how you define millennial kingdom. If by millennial kingdom you just mean the misthopological kingdom, then of course unfaithful believers are excluded from the millennial kingdom, in that they are excluded from the heavenly city. Also, if you're referring to the promised land, in my assessment, unfaithful Jewish believers are excluded from the promised land. Therefore, those texts which talk about the millennial kingdom and are focused on the promised land, you could say that unfaithful believers are excluded from the promised land, and therefore they're excluded from the millennial kingdom. They will be on the planet Earth, or resurrected mortals will be in the celestial outer darkness. Nevertheless, they are excluded from the city and the promised land. Therefore, this is a form of millennial exclusion. So I can agree with Connell that unfaithful believers are excluded from the millennial kingdom when the millennial kingdom is defined in the terms in which he means, namely the heavenly city, and I would also add the promised land.